Instantly controlling the center, this pawn opens diagonals for development and claims crucial central space. Developing the knight to its natural outpost immediately contests the center's influence and prepares for rapid queenside expansion. Securing central space and preparing queenside expansion to contest the e5 square. Embracing the fianchetto, black prepares to activate the bishop and contest the queenside space. Developing the knight to c3 neatly supports a central pawn push, bolstering control over key squares and preparing for rapid kingside castling while maintaining a flexible pawn structure. Embracing the fianchetto, black solidifies their queenside and prepares for potential central challenges with a beautifully placed bishop. Boldly seizing central space, white aggressively expands, aiming to dominate the board and stifle black's developing pieces. Solidifying the center and preparing to challenge white's pawn structure unlocks further development options. Developing the bishop to support the center and prepare for kingside castling demonstrates sound positional play, aiming for a harmonious setup. Safeguarding the monarch is a prudent decision, prioritizing immediate king safety before initiating counterplay. Developing the knight to e2 instead of the more common nf3 prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm or reinforces the center, while also keeping the f-pawn free for an eventual advance, though it does obstruct the bishop on d3 from seeing the kingside somewhat. Developing the knight to its natural square, this pawn controls key central squares and prepares for further piece coordination, aiming to challenge white's growing central influence and prepare for potential pawn breaks. Safeguarding your monarch becomes the immediate priority, securing its position behind a solid pawn wall and preparing for potential central pawn breaks. Pivoting the knight to d7 secures the central pawn majority and prepares to reinforce the kingside defense, subtly preparing for a potential e5 break later by repositioning pieces for maximum influence. Anchoring the bishop here reinforces the central pawns and prepares for kingside expansion, potentially with f4 while subtly discouraging black's e5 break. Challenging white's central pawn structure immediately ignites a dynamic struggle, aiming to disrupt the opponent's harmonious development and inject immediate tension into the game. Asserting central control by advancing the pawn injects immediate tension, creating a bind and restricting black's piece mobility on the queenside, while simultaneously opening a diagonal for the light-squared bishop. Unleashing the knight to d4 aggressively contests the center and eyes the vulnerable white queen's bishop, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and potentially force structural concessions. A retreat that opens a diagonal for the queen and prepares to contest the c-file, subtly reinforcing the pawn chain's stability. Exchanges on the knight. Black proactively resolves the central pawn chain tension by simplifying, sacrificing tempo for piece activity, and potentially freeing up the c8 square for the rook, while simultaneously offering white a less-than-ideal bishop. Reclaiming the queen, white's recapture on e2 solidifies the pawn chain and prepares for potential central advances, while simultaneously clearing the way for the rook to enter the game via the f1 square. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, black seeks to disrupt white's harmonious piece placement and create attacking chances, even at the cost of potentially weakening their own king's defense. Solidifying the pawn chain against black's kingside expansion, this move aims to secure the e4 pawn and restrict the mobility of black's knight on d4, though it does create a slight weakness on the e3 square and potentially hinders the bishop's development. A bold attempt to wrestle the initiative by creating a passed pawn, but this maneuver significantly weakens the light squares around black's king, potentially opening up avenues for white's pieces to infiltrate and exploit. Sharpening the focus on the kingside, this repositioning of the bishop to f2 is a strategic retreat, not a concession, aiming to reinforce the pawn chain and prepare for potential kingside operations by bringing the king closer to the center of action once the queenside has been secured. The pawn storm erupts, a risky but aggressive assertion of space on the kingside. Black abandons the central pawns to gain attacking momentum, potentially creating weaknesses around their own king in exchange for dynamic counterplay. Wrestling with the encroaching pawn storm, white preemptively shores up the kingside, creating a fortified yet somewhat cramped defensive wall. The pawn sacrifice tears open the kingside, creating a dynamic imbalance as black seeks to exploit the weakened light squares around white's monarch. Opening up the h-file for your rook now presents a potent attacking avenue, directly targeting the weakened kingside structure black has inadvertently created with their pawn advances. The pawn storm on the kingside escalates, threatening to shatter white's defensive pawn structure and open crucial lines towards the king. Opening the f-file for the rook and creating an outpost for the knight are the immediate consequences, but this exchange fundamentally alters the pawn structure, potentially leading to a kingside attack for black if white isn't careful. Black's knight repositions, eyeing the weakened kingside light squares after white's pawn push. This maneuver subtly hints at a potential regrouping for a later queenside counterplay or a repositioning to support a central pawn thrust, creating a dynamic tension as the knight avoids immediate confrontation while seeking better prospects. This pawn thrust aggressively shatters the pawn chain and opens the kingside for a direct assault, leveraging the discovered attack on the pinned knight. Instantly seizing the initiative, the knight embarks on an aggressive foray towards the white king's sanctuary, creating immediate discomfort. This daring excursion probes weaknesses in the pawn structure and challenges white's control of the kingside, threatening to unravel the defense. The knight's presence on g4 promises to amplify pressure, potentially disrupting white's coordination and opening up new avenues for attack. Stepping back to the light-squared bishop to a more central outpost aims to neutralize the active knight and prepare for potential pawn pushes, a classic positional maneuvering under pressure. Unleashing the rook along the open file now seizes a crucial line, aiming to dismantle the defender's pawn shield around their monarch and probe for weaknesses. The king's sudden venture into the open battleground, forced by the tactical exchanges, now presents a significant positional dilemma, demanding immediate defensive attention as black's pieces are poised to exploit the exposed royal figure. Shifting the queen to e8 initiates a positional maneuver, aiming to redeploy the monarch to a more secure outpost and potentially to support an assault on the kingside where white's king now finds itself exposed. A dramatic shift of the monarch occurs, seeking refuge from the encroaching chaos and potential danger that has materialized on the kingside, signaling a critical juncture where king safety takes precedence over immediate attacking ambitions. The queen's audacious surge to h5 injects immediate, untamed energy into the queenside, threatening to unravel white's kingside pawn structure and spotlighting the uncastled monarch's precarious position. Relocating the monarch to the second rank stabilizes the king's position significantly, preparing to join the fight on the queenside and offering a sanctuary from the encroaching dark-squared threats on the kingside. Focusing on pawn structure dynamics and central control, black's bishop now seeks a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing the weakened kingside after white's pawn advances. The previous maneuvering has created a rather unusual pawn structure. White's doubled pawns on the kingside present targets, but black's own g-pawn push also introduced some structural complexities. By repositioning the bishop to d7, black avoids the immediate threats on the b1h7 diagonal and prepares for a potential regrouping of forces. This bishop could swing over to the queenside to support a queenside expansion, or it might simply wait for an opportune moment to contribute to the central struggle or to harass white's king once the central files open up. The placement also subtly reinforces the e5 pawn, which has been a key battleground. A determined effort to stabilize the central pawn structure and prepare for potential activity along the open files. This move reestablishes the bishop's presence on a key diagonal, eyeing black's somewhat exposed kingside and seeking to influence the d5 square, which currently acts as a strong outpost for black's knight. White aims to regain some positional equilibrium after a series of sharp exchanges that have left the position rather complex. The bishop's relocation also frees up the queen to potentially support a further advance or retreat, depending on black's response. Consider the strategic implications of this bishop's placement on d3. It supports the central pawns and offers a defensive shield, while simultaneously preparing for a more active role in the middle game, perhaps by supporting a future c4-c5 pawn push or by targeting the weakened squares around black's king. Opening the f-file for your rook is a bold attempt to inject some life into this rather static position, potentially threatening the isolated g-pawn and forcing white to react. Unleashing a pawn storm is the immediate objective, aiming to pry open the queen side and create attacking chances. The queen ventures out, a bold reconnaissance towards the white king's domain. While it appears to probe for weaknesses, this aggressive positioning on the king side might leave the black monarch exposed to counterplay, particularly along the now open g-file once the dust settles. Consider the sacrifices that might become available to white if they can consolidate their central advantage and target that exposed king. Opening the c-file offers a direct avenue for the white rooks to infiltrate black's position. The pawn thrust on d6 opens the c-file for your rook and aims to challenge white's central pawn structure, potentially creating counterplay for your queenside pieces. White seizes an opportunistic pawn on the edge, disrupting the pawn chain's integrity, but it leaves the file open to potential black infiltration. This aggressive grab, while temporarily increasing white's material, diverts the bishop from crucial central squares where it could contest black's burgeoning kingside pressure. Consider the immediate repercussions of allowing the rook to establish a strong presence on the open file. The immediate gain of a pawn might be illusory if black can consolidate their forces and exploit the exposed king position or the newly opened pathways. Initiating an assault on the queenside, black aims to disrupt white's attacking formation and potentially open lines for counterplay, though it risks weakening their own pawn structure in the process. Initiating an assault on the open f-file, this redeployment forces a reckoning with the exposed black king. This is an audacious attempt to exploit the suddenly open c-file and pressure white's recently advanced rook, but it may be premature given the defensive capabilities still surrounding the white king. Snapping up the pawn on a7 fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating a dynamic imbalance and forcing black to reconsider their queenside initiative as a serious threat evaporates. The rook's descent to b8 bravely confronts the encroaching bishop, seeking counterplay by challenging the pawn chain's integrity and potentially disrupting white's queenside ambitions. Repositioning the bishop to g1 seeks to bolster the kingside defense, anticipating further black incursions along the open h-file, while simultaneously preparing for a potential regrouping of pieces to either support the central pawn push or join an assault. A fascinating discovered check, aiming to disrupt white's recently established piece coordination and exploit the exposed monarch. Relinquishing the b7 pawn to activate the queen on an open diagonal allows white to escape immediate tactical complications, aiming for a more controlled middle game and potential endgame advantages. Unleashing the queen into the heart of white's position, this move initiates a dramatic tactical sequence where the exposed monarch becomes the prime target. Suddenly, the queen reroutes, aiming to exploit the exposed white monarch, forcing a desperate defensive scramble. Unleashing a potent check, this advance aggressively challenges the white king's precarious sanctuary, creating immediate tactical complications and forcing a defensive response that could further expose white's weakened king position. Sacrificing the queen to disrupt the pawn structure and create an unexpected endgame transition, forcing black to choose between recapturing with the king and exposing it, or continuing with a less active pawn capture. The exchange of queens transforms the battlefield into a tactical minefield where pawn structure and piece activity will dictate the outcome. Your pawn on f4, a bold spearhead, now demands immediate attention, potentially opening lines for your remaining pieces if white isn't careful. The question is whether this central dominance can be sustained against white's coordinated threats. The rook reclaims its file, a crucial reclamation given the now exposed kingside and black's bishop pair. The knight hops into the fray, aiming to disrupt white's newly established pawn structure and perhaps find some activity on the kingside. Shifting the monarch to safety, white aims to disengage from the immediate tactical crossfire, seeking a more stable defensive posture while eyeing potential counterplay on the king side. Rethinking the threat to the pawn and redeploying the rook to support the passed pawn's advance represents a solid defensive maneuver. Navigating the knight's gambit, a strategic reorientation. The knight's repositioning to e2 signals a crucial strategic pivot, shifting focus from the immediate, aggressive pawn push on the king side to a more measured development and eventual defense of the weakened king position. After the chaotic skirmishes, White acknowledges the exposed nature of their monarch and the potential for Black's remaining pieces to exploit the open lines. This maneuver is less about initiating an attack and more about consolidating resources, aiming to shore up the kingside pawn structure and prepare for the endgame. The knight's journey, while seemingly slow, is a calculated effort to find a more secure outpost and potentially reinforce the center or prepare for a subtle queenside counterplay if Black overcommits. It's a subtle acknowledgement of the positional concessions made earlier, a breathing room sought before the true endgame battle commences. Unleashing a pawn's potential, this aggressive advance aims to pry open the kingside and create immediate threats against White's somewhat exposed monarch. Pushing the g-pawn again creates an immediate tension, potentially opening a new pathway for the rook or forcing Black into a passive defensive posture as the pawn advances towards the promotion square. Reclaiming lost initiative, Black squares up the board, aiming to disrupt White's centralized pieces and open lines for counterplay, a bold gambit to awaken a dormant position. A calculated retreat, this rook repositions to defend crucial squares and prepare for a potential endgame battle, aiming to solidify White's pawn structure against Black's active pieces. Bringing the bishop back into play here aims to challenge White's control of the dark squares, specifically eyeing that loose rook on f3 and potentially creating attacking opportunities down the c-file or even along the third rank should White's king remain exposed. The knight's repositioning to g3 aims to leverage the open files and the newly activated g-pawn to create immediate threats against Black's king, exploiting the weakness left by the pawn structure. The pawn's determined march up the kingside aims to disrupt White's pieces and potentially create a passed pawn, but it also exposes Black's own king to unforeseen dangers from White's remaining rook and knight. Bolstering the a7 pawn and preparing to advance the center pawns, this move seeks to stifle Black's initiative and potentially create a passed pawn on the queen side. Unleashing a king's assault, Black's bishop pierces the White defenses, forcing the monarch to a precarious square, potentially creating devastating mating patterns. The king vacates a dangerous diagonal, seeking refuge behind its pawns while allowing the rook to potentially activate on the open file. A calculated sortie to the queen side, aiming to exploit White's compromised king's safety by activating a knight that was previously pinned, potentially creating mating threats or forcing further concessions. Unleashing the bishop from its defensive post after a period of quiet observation finally addresses White's lack of central influence and opens avenues for potential kingside aggression, aiming to exploit the exposed Black monarch and create threats against the g-file. The knights are now exchanged, a crucial turning point, and Black aims to exploit the open lines and the slightly exposed White king by activating the bishop on h6. The rook's return to the third rank unlocks a critical open file, immediately posing a threat to Black's now exposed king on g3. The pawn on h4 suddenly appears to be White's greatest concern, a potential spearhead pushing into the uncomfortably open kingside. A strategic retreat to safety for the king, seeking to consolidate forces behind its pawn structure and avoid further complications in the center while White's rooks begin their ascent. The rook slides across to the open e-file, activating its presence and eyeing potential weaknesses on the White king's side, preparing to exert pressure along that critical corridor. Unlocking the central pawn creates a dynamic tension, potentially opening lines for your king to participate more actively while forcing the opponent to react to the immediate threat. The central pawn structure is exploding, forcing an immediate reevaluation of piece placement. Black's initiative is palpable as the open files present both opportunity and peril, demanding careful calculation of exchanges and pawn advances to avoid falling behind in development. Unleashing the pinned bishop now offers a surprising tactical advantage, threatening a discovered attack on the black king and aiming to dislodge the powerful knight. A desperate gambit to disrupt the pawn chain and create a potential passed pawn on the king side. The current position presents a strategic dilemma for black. White's e-pawn, supported by the bishop on e3, is poised to advance, potentially cutting off black's king and creating further positional weaknesses. Black's move, pushing the e-pawn forward, is an attempt to break this rigid structure. By offering this pawn sacrifice, black hopes to untangle their pieces and possibly create counterplay, perhaps through an open king's file or by forcing a king's sortie. However, this aggressive maneuver also risks exposing the black king further if white can navigate the tactical complexities effectively. The immediate consequence is a shift in the pawn structure, which could lead to either a sharp tactical battle or a complex maneuvering game, depending on how white responds. The ultimate success of this move hinges on black's ability to generate sufficient compensation for the pawn and exploit any ensuing weaknesses in white's camp. Contesting the rook's activity on the third rank is paramount, as leaving it unopposed allows it to dominate the open file and create devastating threats against your exposed king. Unleashing the bishop, this maneuver seeks to activate the queen's flank pressure, aiming to exploit the open diagonal and potentially create threats against white's king if a path can be cleared. Asserting control over the central files and creating potential breakthroughs becomes paramount here. The current position demands a re-evaluation of the defensive structure. The passed pawn on the E file, though currently blocked, represents a significant long-term threat that needs careful neutralization. By placing the bishop on F4, white aims to support the advance of that pawn and simultaneously eye the weakened dark squares around black's king, which has been pushed too far forward and is starting to feel exposed. This also prepares for potential pawn pushes on the king side, aiming to open lines for attack or to gain space. It's a subtle but important shift, preparing for a more active phase of the game where positional advantages can be converted into tactical opportunities. The pawn on H3 is a persistent nuisance, aiming to march forward and create another passed threat, forcing white to remain constantly vigilant and preventing any comfortable maneuvering with the bishop. Pushing the d-pawn now opens a crucial corridor towards black's king, a bold gambit for attacking potential. The bishop now anchors the d6 pawn, a crucial defensive duty while simultaneously preparing to potentially support a breakthrough on the king side if white commits too heavily to the queen side. The monarch scrambles to safety, seeking refuge from the encroaching pawn storm and the ever-present threat of opposition. A crucial decision point as the black king seeks to escape the immediate threats and find safety behind its pawn shield. Unleashing a potent discovered attack, this rook check aims to dislodge the defending king and exploit the exposed dark squares on the king side, potentially leading to a forced sequence that simplifies into a winning endgame. Embrace the looming opposition by maneuvering your king towards the center, aiming to connect with the passed pawn and deny white's monarch any active participation in the impending endgame. The knight sidesteps, preparing to reinvade the queen side and challenge black's newly found outpost, aiming to disrupt the pawn storm's momentum by creating counterplay. Pushing the pawn here finally clarifies the pawn structure, directly threatening the white king's defensive shield by eyeing that weak e-pawn. Unleashing the pawn's final surge, this move seeks to seal the game by eliminating the defender of the crucial square, forcing a decisive endgame transition. A desperate attempt to force a draw through perpetual check by sacrificing the pawn, hoping to lure the king into a vulnerable square or force a stalemate. Seizing the knight opens up a clear path for your king to enter the endgame, aiming to support the passed pawn. Sacrificing the bishop to disrupt white's monarch's safety opens up the critical diagonal, aiming to exploit the exposed king and reignite black's offensive potential in the chaotic aftermath of the pawn push. The king abandons its protective pawn shield to hunt for respite on the queen side, a bold gambit to escape the encroaching enemy rooks. The rook's repositioning to e4 injects renewed attacking energy, preparing to infiltrate white's weakened queen side and pressure the d-pawn, a crucial anchor for white's pieces. The monarch scrambles for safety, but the unleashed pawns on the kingside offer little protection, inviting further incursions. This maneuver aims to obstruct the white king's escape route and prepare a potential infiltration of the black bishop, aiming to disrupt white's piece coordination and perhaps find avenues for further advancement of the passed pawn. Anchoring the rook on the 6th rank immediately cuts off the opposing king's escape squares and prepares for a potential breakthrough with the pawn, aiming to exploit the exposed enemy monarch. The bishop retreats, a calculated redeployment to bolster the defense of the 6th rank, aiming to prevent any further infiltrations by white's pawns and potentially setting up a discovered attack if the opportunity arises. Opening the d-file for the rook now establishes a direct threat on the opposition's monarch, forcing a defensive reaction and potentially creating new lines for attack. The bishop's retreat to d8 prepares for a potential exchange, aiming to simplify the position and perhaps create a passed pawn on the kingside for the bishop to defend, but it relinquishes control of the critical central dark squares that were previously under its watch. Activating the pawn signals an attempt to gain queenside space and potentially create a passed pawn of its own, though the immediate threat isn't obvious and could be a time-consuming diversion given the king's precarious position. This pawn's desperate lunge creates an immediate pawn race, aiming to become a queen before white's rook can intercept, but it overlooks the critical support from the bishop, which is currently pinned, rendering the advance futile and allowing white to solidify their advantage. The king, now exposed after its long journey, finds itself directly in the crosshairs of black's remaining pieces, a perilous situation demanding immediate defensive attention rather than further territorial ambitions. Embrace the endgame's stark reality. The king, now a vulnerable pawn on the open board, becomes the focal point of this desperate chase, forcing black's own monarch into a defensive stance to parry white's impending promotion threat. Unleashing the bishop to its intended role, this move repositions the piece from a passive guard to an active defender, aiming to solidify the king's safety by adding another layer of protection against any potential mating threats from the opposing queen and rook. Sacrificing the rook here is a desperate attempt to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure, hoping to create chaos and perhaps a stalemate, but it frankly feels like a last resort with little genuine hope of salvation given the position of black's monarch. Reclaiming the open file allows the rook to challenge black's passed pawn and potentially create counterplay. Embracing the advanced square, black's king now ventures onto territory previously dominated by its counterpart, initiating a daring pursuit of the isolated passed pawn that could unravel white's remaining defenses. Reclaiming the central file presents a crucial opportunity to consolidate white's advantage, aiming to activate the rook and pressure black's king. The bishop, having sacrificed its partner on the queenside, now actively participates in the struggle for the center, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay. The rook's repositioning aims to secure the pawn's promotion, creating an immediate threat that demands black's full attention. The rook's repositioning to the 7th rank now directly challenges the pawn's structure and eyes the vacant file, creating immediate pressure and forcing white into a more passive defensive posture. Steering the bishop towards the queenside to reinforce the pawn's structure and prepare for potential threats, while simultaneously preparing to support the king's safety. The rook's repositioning to b7 aims to consolidate its presence on the queenside, preparing to contest the b-file and potentially infiltrate black's weakened pawn structure, while simultaneously offering support to the king's shelter. Asserting pressure on the king with a discovered attack, this move forces black to respond immediately to the exposed monarch. The black king, currently feeling quite exposed, scurries towards the queenside seeking refuge, hoping to find sanctuary behind the pawns there. Shifting the bishop to e1 is a strategic repositioning aimed at supporting the pawn advance on the queenside and potentially rerouting the king to a more active central square should the opportunity arise. A desperate king check, attempting to disrupt white's mating net and salvage something from a lost position, but the rook's clear path to the kingside and the looming pawn advance on the d-file render this a mere formality before the inevitable checkmate. King's escape hatch sought amidst potential mating threats. The bishop's repositioning aims to support the pawn's advance towards the 7th rank, potentially creating a powerful passed pawn. But it also leaves the king's defenses slightly more exposed to counterplay along the c-file should white find a way to open it. Securing the bishop's retreat path while simultaneously threatening a potential invasion on the 8th rank offers a subtle but potent positional advantage. The bishop's retreat to e4, while seemingly passive, aims to unblock the defender of the a7 pawn and potentially reinforce the central presence, though it sacrifices immediate counterplay. The king steps out into the open, a bold maneuver aiming to potentially evade the persistent checks and find a safer haven, or perhaps even become an active participant in the unfolding struggle. The bishop swoops in, a daring check that forces the white king into a precarious position on the edge of the board, creating immediate attacking opportunities for black's remaining pieces and potentially disrupting white's defensive coordination.